Putin thought he could steamroll Ukraine and rebuild his empire. Instead, he's driving Russia straight into the ground. His military is falling apart, soldiers are ditching the fight, and his economy is on life support. In today's video, we're exposing just how badly Putin screwed up. From troops sabotaging their own missions to his crumbling empire, we're digging into the mess he's created. You don't want to miss how deep this disaster really goes, because while stories about collapsing Russian morale are nothing new, what's happening now is on a whole new level. Putin has created a meat grinder of a war, in which his key to success is to throw untold thousands of Russian soldiers at Ukrainian positions until he eventually overwhelms them. At best, that approach has experienced mixed success, with Russia slowly taking territory in the Donbas region of Ukraine while losing thousands of troops in the process, 643,750 of them, if the armed forces of Ukraine's figures are to be believed. That meat grinder approach has led to morale being a massive problem since at least 2023. In August of that year, Defense Post reported on comments made by Sergei Gulyayev, who served as a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet army and apparently has connections with key Russian officials who have been deployed in Ukraine. Gulyayev painted a picture of a brutal war in which Russian soldiers are ill-equipped as they're left in trenches for months on end. They watch their comrades die, knowing that their own deaths will likely not be too far behind, all in service of a leader who doesn't want to help them. The army despises Putin, Gulyayev says, while pointing out that many of the Russian soldiers on the front lines are forced to buy body armor and other equipment with their own wages. Gulyayev went on to point out that Russia also lacks reserves. We'll cover the manpower issue soon, which means that many of its soldiers are denied leave. That's assuming that leave would even be possible, claims the former Soviet colonel, as many have to sit in trenches for months without access to any vehicles capable of extracting them. He claims there have been incidents in which he's been asked to buy military jeeps by officials on the front lines because Russia's soldiers don't even have access to military ambulances to evacuate wounded soldiers. It all has a real demoralizing effect, claims Gulyayev, who says that the anger that stems from this low morale has resulted in Russian soldiers sabotaging their own operations. Fast forward to 2024, and those morale issues have only worsened, leading to thousands of Russian soldiers deserting their posts. There have been numerous instances of these desertions, with one of the most recent coming in June 2024. With morale along frontline troops plummeting, Russia is losing up to 1,200 soldiers per day to fighting in the Donbas region of Ukraine. With the increasing death toll comes more desertions. We've also seen similar collapses of morale during Ukraine's Kursk invasion. A September 2024 report in The Guardian claims that seized papers show that Russia anticipated an incursion into Kursk several months in advance of it happening. Did Putin reinforce Kursk's defenses once he had that information? Of course he didn't. He was too focused on the meat grinder in the Donbas. The result was hundreds of Russian soldiers stationed in Kursk surrendering without putting up a fight. Ukraine claimed to have seized 594 prisoners of war in the first 3 weeks of the incursion. Putin is following an unsustainable strategy in which he simply throws soldiers at Ukraine to try and win through manpower alone. But in doing that, he's failing to properly equip those soldiers, and he's left them in situations that result in rapidly declining morale and large-scale desertions. Hardly ideal for Russian commanders trying to organize operations. Let's hone in on this equipment problem. Beyond Russia's failure to provide the basics, such as body armor, to its soldiers, its military faces a far more damaging problem in terms of the larger military equipment it's been using to fight the war. Tanks and artillery have been pivotal to the Russian strategy, with much of Putin's success stemming from the fact that Russia has more of each than Ukraine. Or perhaps that should be had rather than has. It's no secret that Russia has been relying on Soviet-era tanks and artillery to maintain pressure on Ukraine's defenses. The T-80 tanks that have made up the majority of its tank offensives were first built in 1976, albeit with upgrades in the years that followed, and some of the tanks Russia has used against Ukraine date back to World War II. That was fine, even if it showcased the Russian military's lack of modern equipment, because Putin had vast reserves of these old pieces of equipment to call upon. Those reserves are rapidly running out. In an April 2024 article for Forbes, military analyst David Axe made the bold claim that Russia only has a 1-year reserve of weapons before it'll run out and be forced to withdraw from Ukraine. Axe points out that superior Ukrainian tactics have led to Russia losing far more than Ukraine despite its many military advantages. Those losses include 15,300 tanks, armored fighting vehicles and howitzers, along with other weapons, 3 times the losses Ukraine has suffered. Those losses aren't sustainable. Even with Russia's war production machine churning, the country only produces between 500 and 600 new tanks annually, with little more than 1,000 fighting vehicles at the same time. Given that Russia is losing well over 1,000 tanks per year, along with close to 2,000 vehicles, production isn't keeping up with the losses. That's why Russia relies so heavily on its Soviet-era stockpiles. The problem for Putin is that those stockpiles are finite. There's only so much old equipment he can pull out of mothballs. And as of July 2024, those stockpiles may be about to finally run out. That's according to Pravda, which says that Russia has been attempting to mask its low stockpiles with boasts of new deliveries. These boasts include mentions of receiving 1,530 tanks throughout 2023 from Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. What Shoigu didn't mention is that 85% of those tanks were ancient T-72s, T-62s, and T-55s. Those tanks, despite being slightly upgraded, are rapidly being destroyed, and there aren't many more left for Russia to use. Artillery is also a problem, claims Pravda. Russia has plenty of shells, with 3 million in stock thanks to its ties with North Korea. But having 3 million shells means little if the artillery firing them is wearing out. That's precisely what's happening. Russia is already putting old artillery barrels from its Soviet-era systems to use for newer artillery. It's done this 4,800 times already, with only 7,000 barrels remaining. Worse yet for Putin, these older barrels have already experienced wear and tear, in addition to poor storage conditions, meaning they wear out faster than a brand new barrel would. A critical point of exhaustion is coming for Russia's tanks and artillery. Both Forbes and Pravda claim that the milestone will arrive at some point during the second half of 2025. Those rapidly approaching shortfalls are the main reason why Russia is going to find itself increasingly relying on overseas equipment to continue its fight against Ukraine. That's according to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, which reiterates the point that Russia has relied on its Soviet-era stockpiles to maintain the meat grinder Putin has created. Further mobilization of the country's defense industry is coming, claims ISW, but it's not going to be enough to replace what Russia has already lost. So an increasing reliance on overseas allies will soon become a hallmark of Russia's approach. ISW notes that North Korean artillery ammunition deliveries to Russia have a direct and rapid effect on the war's dynamics, with each delivery spurring renewed assaults against Ukrainian positions. As of June 2024, it says, North Korea has delivered 4.8 million artillery shells to Russia, demonstrating just how much Russia's production capacity has fallen off due to a combination of issues that include Western sanctions and a lack of labor. Russia is also trying to create similar relationships with Iran and China, turning them into suppliers for its war machine. That may seem fine on the surface, but think about what this means for Russia's military. The need to purchase weapons from other countries means Russia is a far cry from the nation that was once one of the world's largest arms suppliers. Russia's arms exports have plummeted since the beginning of the Ukraine war, transforming one of the country's booming businesses and a major contributor to its economy into a sector that can charitably be defined as faltering. Defense News made this clear in May 2024. It notes that the sales of Russian weapons to other countries between 2019 and 23 are down 53% on the sales achieved between 2014 and 18. Even within that 2019 to 23 period, Russia's weapons industry has been hit hard by sanctions and a simple lack of appetite from nations that don't want to support Putin's special military operation. In 2019, Russia had 31 countries as customers for the weapons it produces. By 2023, that number had fallen to just 12. And of those 12, sales to the likes of India, Egypt, and China have all declined. India is now spending 34% less on Russian weapons than it did between 2014 and 18, with Egypt also spending 54% less. It all adds up to a Russian military that's not only unable to produce at a high enough capacity to provide for itself, but it's also losing the ability to sell the weapons it creates to others. The new weapons are all going into fighting Ukraine, taking a massive bite out of an industry that was a significant contributor to Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, before the war began. And that brings us to another reason why Russia's military is on the verge of collapse. It has a major manpower problem. Earlier we talked about low morale and desertion playing a role in the collapse. Neither of those problems is going to disappear when Putin is relying on mobilization and the issuing of what some in Russia are calling illegal orders for the country's men to go to war. Putin has already issued one mobilization order through which he essentially conscripted thousands of Russians to go into a war for which many don't have an appetite. In the run-up to the 2024 Russian presidential elections, he did everything he could to avoid a second mobilization, preferring instead to try to buy blood instead of mobilization, according to Tufts University military expert Pavel Lutzin. Dara Masikot of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace agrees with this analysis, claiming that the Kremlin would prefer to offer large sums of money for volunteers, raid the Russian prison system, restaurants, or other gatherings for manpower, ahead of implementing another round of mobilization. Remember that this is a country that's losing up to 1,200 soldiers per day and has already lost a total of more than 640,000 in Ukraine. And as of August 2024, Putin has doubled contract payments to the soldiers he's trying to draw into his military, meaning his special military operation is costing Russia's economy more and more with each passing month. It's an unsustainable system, with Putin constantly shelling out to keep the war running while attempting to avoid a round of mobilization that seems inevitable simply because the money is eventually going to run out. Russia may not be running out of soldiers it can send to the front on the surface, but it's long since run out of soldiers who actually want to be there, meaning those heading to the front lines are poorly trained and even more likely to desert than those who came before them. Russia is simply running out of manpower. And that leads us nicely into the economic collapse that's coming to the country. Much of that collapse is going to occur because Russia is fast running out of the workers it needs to keep its war industry churning and, crucially, to get the country back on a sound economic footing once the war is over. Euronews highlighted this in an August 2024 article in which it claimed that Russia's entire economy finds itself dealing with a precarious position in which it's trying to balance its need for labor with the military manpower Putin requires to feed into his meat grinder. The article highlights the direct economic impact of Putin's decision to provide payments to relatives of dead soldiers while focusing on hiring contract soldiers. In payments alone, Russia spent $33.3 billion between June 2023 and June 2024, an amount Euronews says is equivalent to 1.5% of the country's GDP. Throw in the increase in the lump sum being offered to contract soldiers to join the war, increasing to over $17,700 without accounting for the regular pay that follows, and you have a clear drain on the nation's economy. But far more worrying for Russia is the drain on manpower and long-term impact that it's going to have on Russia. International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn research fellow Ivan Klisic points out that Russia's military is now directly competing with the country's other industries to attract people. This creates a dilemma for Russia. State interests are conflicting. University College London professor Mark Kultkepp summarizes the problem, stating that Russia's military had to compete with Russian employers in strategically important sectors. This creates not just competition over pay, but also dilemmas of which state interests to prioritize, he says. The run-on effect of these manpower issues is that Russia is running the risk of shortages within its civilian economy. That civilian sector is also being forced to increase wages to appear more attractive than a military career, which, given that so much of that sector is wrapped up in the Russian state, will ultimately lead to the country itself being more out of pocket. These rapidly rising wages will also fuel inflation, making the cost of living in Russia higher than it's ever been, and potentially forcing interest rate hikes that will prevent regular citizens from borrowing money. It's like a row of dominoes just waiting to cascade. Putin is well aware of the problem. December 2023 brought with it the news that Russia is already short some 4.8 million workers, with that problem only going to get worse as more men are lured into the military with promises of high contract pay. By June 2024, Putin was forced to acknowledge this growing problem, though he tried to spin the numbers by claiming that the shortages were a result of Russia's record-low unemployment rate rather than anything to do with his war. Still, he had to admit that the lack of labor limits economic growth in an address on the Kremlin website, though he also proposed a solution to the problem: attracting qualified migrants from abroad. That solution seems to heavily involve North Korea, with which Russia has signed a cooperative defense pact in the summer of 2024. Several sources, including Daily NK and The Diplomat, say that North Korea is sending more and more laborers to Russia to help with its manpower crisis. The latter says that 150 North Koreans found themselves transported to the Donbas region of Ukraine in January 2024 alone, with more flying into Vladivostok by the month. As for Daily NK, it claims that North Korea's Central Committee has ordered the country's Workers' Party to prioritize recruiting workers to send overseas. There's a problem with this approach, and it's the same one that we see with Russia becoming increasingly reliant on North Korea for its artillery shells and other military equipment. Putin is burrowing himself deeper into North Korea's pocket. The Russian president keeps calling in favors, which means he's going to have to repay those favors at some point in the future. Maybe Putin realizes that, which is why his health minister is telling Russians to have more sex during work breaks, so he can tackle the country's declining birth rate and lack of labor manpower. If labor shortages are the problem, Putin is quite literally telling his people to pump up the numbers. Putin also claims he's intent on supporting the aspirations of Russians who've reached retirement age to keep on working. In other words, stop retiring and fill in the gaps my unsuccessful war has created. These manpower issues are pushing Russia closer to the brink of economic collapse. That may seem like a strange claim to make, seeing as Russia has a growing economy. The International Monetary Fund suggests the country will record economic growth of 3.2% by the end of 2024, propped up by a militaristic industrial sector that has grown to support the war. But what these seemingly positive figures hide is the fact that a huge amount of Russia's economy relies on keeping the war going, with so little being done to ensure this growth or even stability will continue in the long term. Looking to the future, Putin's special military operation has also created major issues for another of its major economic drivers, its energy sector. According to the Ukrainian World Congress, or UWR, approximately 90% of Russia's oil imports go through the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. That could present a problem for Putin, as Russia doesn't control the exits to either of these seas. The Black Sea is essentially controlled by Turkey, which has already prevented Russia from reinforcing its Black Sea fleet with new ships following Ukraine successfully destroying about a third of that fleet. As for the Baltic Sea, transit exits are overseen by Denmark. Turkey and Denmark are NATO members, with economist Yuri Gorodnichenko arguing that if either gains the political will to prevent Russia from exporting its oil through the Baltic and Black Seas, Russia will end very quickly. He has a point. Russia's combined coal, gas, liquid natural gas, and oil sales were over $1 billion per day during the first half of 2022. Then Western sanctions hit, which included many of Ukraine's supporters refusing to buy from the country or only doing so at massively reduced prices, and those sales have declined ever since. In August 2024, Russia's daily sales were at $706.91 million per day, with that figure also representing an 8% decline from the month prior. Losing $300 million per day is going to have an effect on any country. For Russia, it amounts to a $109.5 billion shortfall in energy sales, which is billions of dollars that can no longer go toward fueling its war effort or propping up its faltering economy. The problem for Putin is that Russia's war machine is being funded by its energy sales. As CEPA points out, Russia is likely going to spend 6% of its GDP on its military in 2024 alone. When combined with state disbursements for other war-related items, which includes things like construction within the territories Russia occupies in Ukraine, Russia will have spent $401 billion on the war in Ukraine in 2024. That's a 26.2% increase on the amount it spent in 2023, highlighting just how vital the war has become to Russia's economy. Putin needs to keep the war going to see any sort of return from the massive amounts he's pumping into manufacturing weapons. And he's also going to have to raise taxes and watch his country buckle under the weight of 8% inflation and a 16% base rate of interest as he does. Those energy sales also play a large role in keeping Russia's National Wealth Fund, or NWF, liquid. Therein lies another economic problem caused by Putin's war. The NWF has fallen by about $58 billion since February 2022, leaving just $55 billion available. That fund, which Putin has increasingly relied upon to fund the massive contracts he's handing out to soldiers, is quickly running out. Combine that with lower energy market sales, and you get a recipe for an oil and gas-reliant country to fall into a steep economic decline once the war ends. That decline may even come during the war. If it lasts for another 2 years, sanctions will only intensify, and Russia will deplete the NWF entirely. The simple fact is that Russia is edging towards an economic crisis as severe as its military crisis. It's spending too much on the war, not making enough money back to cover those costs, and facing a labor shortage so severe that Putin is having to officially encourage the Russian people to have more children. These massive military and economic challenges are reason enough for Russia being on the brink of collapse. But for Putin himself, they represent something far more dangerous: the constant erosion of his power base at home. Putin, like so many Russian leaders before him, maintains power by positioning himself as the strongman of Russian politics. He's the leader who can get things done, a man who will make Russia more powerful than it's ever been before. This image is so important to Putin in a political sense that losing even a small portion of it chips away at the very foundation of his power. If Russia doesn't see Putin as the strongman, he faces political collapse. And right now, Putin looks anything but strong. His military has proven to be something of a paper tiger, with Russia having fallen from one of the most feared nations in the world to one that isn't capable of defeating a much smaller country. Every Russian soldier who dies on the battlefield is a small shot to Putin's image as the strongman. Worse yet for Putin, several major events during the war have tarnished his reputation even further. The military group Wagner marching 5,000 of its soldiers toward Moscow was a warning. Granted, that mutiny didn't last long, and Putin quickly took care of Wagner's leader in the aftermath, but it showed that Putin wasn't immune to challenges. far more damaging to Putin is the Kursk invasion, through which Ukraine has managed to take control of at least 92 settlements in the Russian oblast, along with holding 450 square miles of territory. It's the largest invasion launched on Russian soil since World War II, and it all happened on Putin's watch. The message Kursk sends to the Russian people is clear: Putin can't protect you. The fact that the invasion began in early August and Putin has still done very little about it only reinforces that message. The strongman of Russian politics is standing by helplessly as more of his country is overrun by an enemy that should have been too weak to stop him. Putin's glaring personal weaknesses are also being reflected by the Kremlin. A week after the Kursk invasion began, the ISW published an article in which it highlighted key Russian political weaknesses that can all be traced back to Putin. It says that Russia, though capable of adaptation over time, isn't able to pivot quickly because Putin is so risk-averse. Russia's leader taking several months to adapt to his initial failure to take Ukraine is an example of this, as is Putin's partial mobilization in September 2022. At that time, by only mobilizing a small portion of Russia, Putin cut himself off at the knees for future mobilization efforts, as evidenced by his hesitancy to announce a second round of mobilization in 2024. Russia's formation of partnerships with the likes of North Korea and China also presents long-term problems. There's a give and take to these types of arrangements, with every country that's supporting Russia likely to come calling for repayment of the favors later. Given that Russia is in such a weakened state already, with further weakening likely as the Ukraine war goes on, there's a good chance that the country will become beholden to others, even if it manages to win the Ukraine war. The Russian people will recognize this. That's why they're slowly, albeit not publicly, turning against him and the political structure he's created. Political apathy reigns supreme in Russia right now, with foreign policy claiming that many in the country expect Russia to receive nothing from Putin's war and, perhaps more importantly, don't even seem to care about that fact. Many Russians simply want their people to come back home, as a poll conducted by Chronicles revealed in September 2024. So dented is the Russian people's collective belief in their leader that 49% now back a complete withdrawal of troops, followed by peace talks with Ukraine. That's a 9% increase over the 40% of Russians who said the same in January 2024, and it shows that the Kursk invasion has shaken Russia's belief in Putin as a man who can protect them. That loss of public confidence may be more damaging to Putin than anything else. He's already overseen a war that's cost Russia hundreds of thousands of people while depleting its military stockpiles. Putin has allowed Russia to loosen its position as one of the world's top arms manufacturers, spent heavily out of Russia's national reserves, and allowed the country's energy industry to lose hundreds of billions of dollars per year. Russia has a manpower crisis so enormous that Putin is willingly putting Russia under the thumb of other countries to solve his people problem. And through it all, he's allowed the biggest invasion into Russia since World War II and has proven that he, his political allies, and the military he has long used to threaten the rest of the world are far weaker than anybody ever anticipated. The Russian military, economic, and political collapses are coming. The question now is, will those collapses take Putin and his cronies with them? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Soviet Collapse 2.0, Putin's Empire Crumbles, or click this other video instead.